Thomas Maitland's 1871 fleshly school of poetry attack on the painter-poet Dante Gabriel Rossetti, his contemporaries, and Pre-Raphaelite literary and visual arts sparked one of the most well-known cultural controversies of the 19th century. His contemporary review article is fierce. Pre-Raphaelitism is immorally sensual, diligently spreading the seeds of disease, and shocking in its implication that the body is greater than the soul. Its poets are public offenders, and Rossetti's work is morbid trash, replete with nastiness and females who bite, scratch, scream, bubble, and in a general way slather over their lovers. The nom de plume was traced back to the Scottish writer Robert Buchanan, and in December that year, the Athenaeum carried Rossetti's methodical and measured reply, The Stealthy School of Criticism. In it, Rossetti posits that art requires an inner standing point, precisely because the beauty and pity, the self-questions and all questions which it can bring with it, can come with full force only from the mouth of one alive to its whole appeal, such as the speaker put forward in the poem Jenny, a young and thoughtful man of the world. But fleshliness is a matter of corporeality, not the ebb and flow of empirical evidence. Buchanan summarizes the thrust of his pejorative fleshly label as such, that fleshly gentlemen have bound themselves by solemn league and covenant to extol fleshliness as the distinct and supreme end of poetic and pictorial art, to aver that poetic expression is greater than poetic thought, and by inference, that the body is greater than the soul. Art historical and literary scholarship consider Buchanan's attack and the fleshly label to be poorly evidenced hyperbole, reliant on selective quotations and of little critical merit. The problem for scholarship, however, is that the fleshly epithet and theorization comes to us originally from friend and not foe. A.C. Swinburne uses the now derogatory fleshly label 4 times in his 1870 reading of the same collection of Rossetti poems for the Fortnightly Review. More than this, Swinburne constructs his idealization of the in-group as a human fellowship of the fleshly brotherhood, in whose writing no spiritual station of command is assumed, no vantage ground of outlook from hills of holiness or heights of moral indifference. This analysis of the underlying principles of Pre-Raphaelite poetry has, putting aside the diametrically opposed conclusions each critic draws from the absence of obvious and absolute moral didacticism, some uneasy alignment with the fleshly school attack. Buchanan again. In spite of its spasmodic ramifications in the erotic direction, fleshliness is a quality which becomes unwholesome when there is no moral or intellectual quality to temper and control it. Indeed, Buchanan's characterization of Rossetti's work as morbid deviation from healthy forms of life, rich with a sense of weary, wasting, yet exquisite sensuality, stands out like a Swinburnian jewel, glimmering in the text with a tempting taboo. Fleshly, then, I think merits scholarly attention, not for the sake of correction, overcorrection, or for contrarian reasons, but precisely because the label's application to Pre-Raphaelite literature and art was contested and debated from the very start. Such contestation and debate is erased by the current critical homogenization of the label and the reduction of Buchanan's attack to simple pontification and moral insult. Buchanan does not invent the fleshly label, he appropriates it. More than this, and I think this is the rub, his warping of the label is so successful that the pejorative meaning remains the default to this very day. If Pre-Raphaelitism is fleshly, then it is also a public health risk. Deploying the language of contamination that collapses the systematic order of matter and the symbolic order of purity into one another, Buchanan posits the fleshly school are diligently spreading the seeds of disease broadcast wherever they are read and understood. There's an aesthetic anxiety that underpins this idea that offensive verse possesses an influencing power that might be absent from inoffensive verse. Similarly notable is Buchanan's act of grouping together Jenny, the controversial dramatic monologue about a sex worker, and The Blessed Damozel, a ballad centered on the foundational Rossettian subject of the imparadised woman, and in fact Rossetti's single most important literary work. It's a critical decision that actually brings to mind Jerome McGann's later and laconic observation that the poems are formally, psychically, socially the same kind of work, and that's not in line with critical thinking en masse. Indeed, developing on McGann, Jenny and Damozel share demonstrable similarities. Framed by our recognition of the undercurrent and Buchanan's central stated claim that the fleshly school extols fleshliness, that the body is greater than the soul, it is striking then that Buchanan quotes the following lines from Damozel and presents them as quite without merit and, I quote, almost without meaning. And still she bowed herself and stooped out of the circling charm, until her bosom must have made the bar she leaned on warm, and the lilies lay as if asleep along her bended arm. We get this image set against a sensory backdrop, one that actually reiterates the damosels in paradise circumstances. It's a world where the damosels, other damosels as it were, are speaking among themselves with their virginal chaste names, and souls are flying by them like thin flames. And in it, our damosel is leaning out of that circling charm. We encounter this curious, complex, genuinely quite odd image. She's undoubtedly as blessed as her title implies. She's metaphysically absolved, she's admitted to paradise, and she's adorned with Marian symbols. While J.B. Bullen observes that she is more than the passive object of desire, even her own active desire ring is a definitive construct of male consciousness, and genuinely, if unorthodoxly, assimilated by this blessedness. Elsewhere, this desire appeals to sanctity and permissibility. She seeks the Virgin Mary's approval, God's enactment as a participant, and Christ's involvement in her yearning for her earthly lover. Yet here, to deploy Buchanan's terminology, she is also overbrimming with fleshliness. Her body, sensually warm with desire and from desire ring, has literally heated the inorganic golden bar and the organic Marian symbols of the now wilting lilies. That image alone is disarming enough. The wilting lilies are open to interpretation, but to test Buchanan's attack, can they truly be a value judgment pitting the fleshly above the spiritual? Elizabeth Halsinger summarizes critical tradition as interpreting the warm bar as evident of Rossetti's own fleshly imagination, or of the damosel's incomplete translation from earthly to heavenly lover. She accurately notes it is Rossetti's way of characterizing the narration as that of someone imagining the damosel in heaven in a way that marks his location, locates him within the modern world of the senses, and not indeed paradise. But the form and implication of the assumed male speaker's imagining merits more scrutiny. There is a discernible shift in comparison to earlier omniscience towards speculation. Her bosom must have warmed the bar, and the lilies only bend as if they are sleeping. The image of the damosel's body heat transferring to the gold bar of heaven is one of sensuality and one of embodied sexual potential. The gravity of the latter really rather accentuated by the fact we are unconventionally encountering this in paradise, lest we forget. In this manner, and given this combination of desire and blessedness, it also represents, in a single image, the two discourses that structure the presentation of the damosel throughout the poem. more than simply a strategic detail that threatens to thrust us, the reader, into immediate contact with the damozel. I think it thrusts the reader into contact with a uniquely heavenly, earthly figure. In this image, predicated on the contact point between the body and paradise, she is constructed by male consciousness as simultaneously blessed and desired, spiritual and sensual, with the reader unable to render her one without the other, or to maintain an empirical or analytical distance between the two. Here, in this precise moment, her warm body, the flesh, meets the bar and lilies, the spiritual, with the former fundamentally transferring to and impressing on the latter. Heaven's barrier and flowers are altered for a time, and in altering demonstrate the intensity of that fleshly desire that constructs the damozel. Where Buchanan sees this exaltation of the body over the soul, examining the very evidence he deploys, the literal quotes he uses, and exploring the instability of this oppositional framework, conversely demonstrates the complex, disarming combination of flesh and spirit, the heavenly as anchored in the earthly, and the literal and metaphorical embodiment of the soul. Buchanan's particular inflection of the fleshly label is not simply problematized on its own interlocking terms by the very lines of damozel he critiques as meaningless. His idea that flesh is extolled over the soul is complicated by the combination and ultimate inseparability of body and spirit in Rossetti's work. Rossetti signals something like this in his stealthy school of criticism response, arguing that yes, the delights of the body are declared to be naught if not ennobled by the concurrence of soul at all times. Rossetti's proto-theory is felicitous, if a little understated on this occasion. That concurrence, that intense and intentional enmeshment of the sensual and the spiritual, really is the true center of gravity for the poem, the animus, and also of Jenny, found in the same poem's 1870 volume as Damozel. Turning then to that eponymous sex worker of the dramatic monologue, a form which, it should be noted, maintains the structural impossibility of her having a voice in the text. The speaker, a client, for lack of a better word, renders her both virgin and maudlin, with her lamp like a wise virgin's. This ironic presentation and other allusions sustain the paradox that female sexuality, established in Damozel, is a matter of being simultaneously saturated with desire and yet being blessed. Shameful Jenny, full of grace, is not very far removed from our fleshly, heavenly Damozel. Jenny is not simply another example of the oppositional epistemological framework, though, angel or demon, Mary Virgin or Mary Magdalene, but I think angel and demon, virgin and Magdalene, a construction held together by Rossetti in a single brilliant line, shameful Jenny, full of grace. Elsewhere, the speaker is less thoughtful, less kind, decrying the fact that she has fallen asleep and berating what he sees as her desecrated mind, where all contagious currents meet. Note the discourse of public health and contamination once again. This disruption to a conventional oppositional symbolism appears elsewhere in complex corporeal images. But Buchanan's discussion of Jenny in his fleshly school, Attack, is a similarly odd creature, bolting from one extreme to the other. He declares the first two lines, lazy, laughing, languid Jenny, fond of a kiss and fond of a guinea, as, and this is a direct quote, perfect. And in the same breath, he identifies the imagined vision of seeing Jenny lift her silken skirt to advertise dainties through the dirt, her body a sight of private beauty, overlaid and accessible through public ugliness, as one of the several passages in the volume that are common stock of the walking gentleman of the fleshly school. One cannot help, bemoans Buchanan, wishing that things had remained forever in the asexual state, a reference to Darwin. Our sympathies, I am sure, perk up when he complains about the protracted hankering after a person of the other sex. Clearly, he takes issue with this. Again, the fleshly label is, as Buchanan establishes, a pejorative based on the idea that a select number of so-called Pre-Raphaelite writers and artists extol fleshliness as the distinct and supreme end of poetic and pictorial art, that the body is greater than the soul. Picking up and continuing Buchanan's analysis of the opening of Jenny, we find instead a highly unusual and ambivalent engagement with the sexualized body. Lazy, laughing, languid Jenny, fond of a kiss and fond of a guinea, whose head upon my knee tonight rests for a while, as if grown light with all our dance and the sound to which the wild tune spun you round. Fair Jenny mine, the faultless queen of kisses. The speaker himself is anything but languid. In just the first 4 iambic feet, he introduces the eponymous sex worker and promptly defines her in negation to dynamism, to significance, to seriousness, and to a willingness to expend energy. Ironically, parts of this preempt and, in reading them in dialogue, echo Buchanan's criticism. If fleshly art, paraphrasing Buchanan, is a matter of poetic expression at the expense of poetic thought, then how are we meant to address this value-laden nexus at the center of the opening that defies such categorization? Jenny's mental process and character is apparently marked not by a thoughtfulness, but by the absence of thought itself. Presenting her as neither cogitating nor laboring, the speaker obscures her economic agency and the underlying positive sum exchange between sex worker and client, framing that same association with mere whimsy, fondness. Indeed, the imperfect end rhyme on the very first couplet suggests and unbounces an equation between Jenny and a piece of money itself. But in reality, I think that unbouncing occurs from the very first word onwards. Lazy, as an accusation and moment of moral didacticism, seems particularly desultory when we consider prostitution in relation to the political economy's interconnected terms. As Lydia Need famously observes, the sex worker represents all the terms within capitalist production: human labor, the object exchange, and the seller at once. She blurs categories of bourgeois economics in the same way that she tests the boundary of bourgeois morality. Developing on the implication that the unbounced kiss currency conversion creates, any meaning that it could hold is further obscured by the speaker, the buyer of Jenny's labor and exchange, anointing her the queen of kisses. Categories of bourgeois economics are external to the poem and they're blurred, but so too does the subject-object distinction intrinsic to the poem. The speaker's articulation of the dance's differing consequences, for example. It is only Jenny's agency, our dances spun you, that is inhibited despite them both being subjected to the uninhibited, wild, music and the whirl of the dance. Left only with the wakeful subject to relay the pre-narrative, the same uncertainty that frames the speaker's as if hangs over the reader response to these profoundly, I think, rebarbative comments towards Jenny. The subtle subject-object distinction, combined with this confused and blurring reaction to a female body which defies the terms of the political economy and the work goodliness paradigm, once again, I believe, challenges the very idea that fleshly poetry is actually extolling the body as greater than the soul. If anything, the example at hand, Jenny's body is the specific site of specific site of confused analysis. It is taken to be a reflection and expression of her values, her capacities, and virtues, rather than something to be celebrated despite those values, capacities, and virtues. Discussions of the body are a locus for discussions of the soul. Here and elsewhere in poems 1870, the former cannot eclipse the other or be considered the chief end of poetics. Buchanan really does want us to believe that Rossetti's work is a matter of, and I quote, meat, drink, fought, sinew for the fleshly school. A topography littered with scandalous non-didacticism, shocking celebrations of slathering women, and an orgy of examples in which the body is proclaimed to be the chief end of poetic expression, and greater indeed than the soul itself. What we find when we examine the precise evidence is something more complex and I think more meriting of engagement. The bridging of the body-soul divide and all the moral and aesthetic quandaries that come into bloom when the heavenly is literally embodied in the earthly. Thank you very much for your time.